Hey YouTubers, Strasbourg 1991 Productions, and I'm here for another book haul. This is the third one. I did a previous with the N&W locomotive history in the last 25 years in a previous video. I've actually found a childhood memory, and one of my colleagues' friends actually recommended this book to me, and my uncle was actually a big fan of this book. Steam's Camelot by Jim Wrinn. This is actually the history of the Norfolk Southern Steam Program 28 years ago for operations from 1966 to 1994. This actually features Southern 4501, 282 Mikado built in 1911 by Baldwin, 750 in 1910 Alco built 462 Pacific, 630, 1904 Brooks built consolidation for the Southern Railroad, and 1950 built Class J 611 of 484J and Class A 2664 1218 built in 1943. On the back cover, you have Sister 722, another 1904 consolidation. 2839, a 1938 built 464 Royal Hudson, built for the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And the really two superpower locomotives. 2716, built in 1943 by the American Locomotive Company for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. And number 610, the largest 610, not the 1952 Baldwin Lima Hamilton 280 consolidation for the U.S. Army, but Texas and Pacific 610, the 210-4 built by Lima Locomotive Works in April of 1927. This is one of the books that has every steam excursion program and has every bit of a crew member's history, from the names of Howell Edmonds, Albert Dinkins, Gary Gray, who I'm very close colleagues with, Bill Purdy, the master mechanics of steam, Walter Schweinbraten, who actually worked with Albert Dinkins on a few excursion trips out of 1981. He actually did a photo trip out of from Birmingham to Chattanooga via Sulphur Springs, and actually features Bill Payne on a trip through the Rat Hole, which is also known as the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railroad, which is a subsidiary predecessor of the Southern Railroad at the actual part of the century. Features locomotives like Atlanta West Point 290, Louisville and Nashville 462, number 152, and one of my favorite locomotives to actually have was I think you're going to be in for a real shock, the triple headers of the Independence Limited of 1989, which actually ran from Cleveland to Fort Wayne, Fort Wayne to Newcastle, and through Portsmouth to Bluefield, West Virginia, and from Bluefield, West Virginia to Roanoke. It also features the trip over the triple header to Lynchburg, and 587 hauling the train south on the former AC Atlantic Coastline Southern Main Line, the Champion McDowell Davis's Railroad through Salisbury, North Carolina, and then they have the trip over the Old Fort Loops at Asheville, North Carolina, and actually did a farewell trip to Bulls Gap, Tennessee, which they carried the Lee Alley's three-chime whistle loaned from F.T. Nichols, which was actually it was a copycat of the whistle used on the Abington branch line in 1947 on the old Norfolk and Western Railroad on engine 382, which is actually a copy of the 382 whistle used on the Abington branch from the legendary F.T. Nichols Lee Alley collection. I do recommend looking at some of the older books where the locomotives, it has some locomotives that were never in the footage Silver Steam, but 6910, the Royal Scotsman, actually made an appearance. One of the most unique locomotives that I never expected was Mississippian 77, which is a 280 consolidation, broke a side run on one excursion, never ran again. Quick fact, it's actually exactly the same sister locomotive to the 76, which ran on the Gettysburg Railroad from 1976 up until 1995. That locomotive is now on the B&O Railroad Museum in West Virginia, and the tender of that locomotive is actually being used for Arcade and Attica number 18 down in ran between Arcade and Couriers, New York, which is another section of the video. I do recommend reading this book, and I definitely recommend, if you're not a fan of N&W steam operations and trackage rights and looking at steam locomotives. Some of the books I've actually found are some wrecks, including the dismal wreck in Suffolk in 1986. The two cars that were scrapped were the Queen and Crescent Club, a heavyweight baggage car built in 1923, and the Missionary Ridge, an open-air car coach that was actually built, I think, in 1932 from the Actually, it was built from a Pullman sleeping car, and then it was converted in the 40s to an open-air car. Those two cars were scrapped, and it actually put a permanent ban on open-air equipment and any kind of heavyweight equipment and any general passenger equipment that did not have tight lock coupling at the turn of the century. I definitely also recommend you look. There's some actual footages, including Jack Taylor, Albert Dinkins, Bill Purdy, Bill Payne, Douglas Carn, who recently passed away. He was a member of, he took over for Bill Purdy as the master mechanic of steam. And there were also great footages of Carl Kruger, who's also passed away, Carl Jensen, Ken Miller, who I actually met very many times. He's a great gentleman. You get to know Carl Jensen, and actually some of the people like Scott Lindsay, Gary Gray, Bill Mason. They actually were all part of the crew for the NW chapter Independence Limited 89. But interestingly enough, the footage, which actually came from Grant Geist of Berkshire Video Productions, he's a very good colleague of him. And actually, I've known him since he worked for the Ohio Central Railroad before and even during the Steam Fest in 1997. And he worked with Tim Sposato, Mike Manwiller since Western Maryland Scenic Days, and many more crew members I've never even met. So definitely recommend this book. Another 10 out of 10 highballs. And these railroads like the Southern and N&W are no longer in service. They've actually fallen flags, which they've been bought out, merged, or bankrupt railroads. Even actually shows you one of the books near the end, the epilogue here, actually shows the Independence Limited 89 on the N&W Railroad on the trackage rights of where it actually ran. So many miles and station stops along the way. And then on the other side is the Southern Railroad, which is actually, you actually see predecessors like the Central of Georgia and the Savannah and Atlanta were also bought by the Southern Railroad. And portions of the Atlantic coastline and Cincinnati, New Orleans, CNOTP, which is the Rat Hole, through Bowen Tower near Nicholasville in Kentucky, where the 611 made its first excursion trip in 1989. I also do recommend that some of the areas that were not mentioned are parts of Erie and Angola, New York, for the Buffalo and on the Nickel Plate Main Line. Actually had a few Virginian Railroad trackage rights, and every railroad that you could fall under the fallen flag ownership. L&N, Georgia, Western Railroad of Alabama, Atlanta West Point, Norfolk and Western, Southern, U.S. Army, CNOTP, even RF&P, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac was actually a portion of that railroad as well. I definitely recommend you get this book, another 10 out of 10 highballs. I definitely recommend you look at some of the history and some of the operations these locomotives had during the course of the century of the steam program, 4501 being the grand opener of the locomotives. And every locomotive, whether it was present or not, everything is photographed into it. Both of the 610s, which is one of the consolidations that ran on the U.S. Army, is featured in a few programs. Actually have Southern locomotives, the 722, the 630, the 4501. Also features N&W 611, 1218, Nickel Plate 587, 765, 2716. Even Jack Showalter's 462, number 1238, was featured in a few excursions. Albert Dinkins at the throttle, Howell Edmonds stoking the fire, the senior road foreman of locomotives. Actually, he was good colleagues of Gary Gray, who's with the chapter. I definitely recommend you look at this book. It is an absolute 10 out of 10. I would recommend this to my family. My Uncle John, John DeCarolis, is a big rail fan. Actually knew a few people with the program, John Barnett being one of those people. I definitely recommend you get this book. It is a 10 out of 10 highballs. I recommend you get it. Fantastic history, knowledgeable, has every excursion written from every year, locomotive, etc. So I'll be back for another section of videos sometime later on next week. Until then, Nicholas Medovich speaking. Have a good night.